you so, and I would like to know if you love me.
Welcome back to The Place of Places, a chapter-by-chapter analysis of William Saroyan's 1972 memoir, Places Where I've Done Time. Today, we take a vacation to the Reforma Hotel, Mexico City, 1935. This was the first time Saroyan visited Mexico City, but not the last. He explains that as a teen he had worked with Mexican laborers on a vineyard on Shields Avenue, off Academy, north of the town of Sanger, near Fresno. Sanger was important to him because his father had worked at Droge's vineyard in 1908 when William was born. Peter Droge had become rich with raisin wealth and ran the Monarch Fruit Company, formerly Droge Fruit Co. And then William worked near Droge's in 1924. Anything connected to his father contained significance. What life was like for his father, what he might have been thinking, what kind of work he did. These are the thoughts of many people who have lost their parents young and never got to know them. So working alongside the Mexicans, Saroyan picked up a little Spanish and wanted to know more about their country. He went to the public library, as always, and read a book by Beals. This book was almost certainly Mexico, an interpretation by Carlton Beals, published in 1923. Beals had lived in Mexico for many years, and this was a history book that spent a good deal of time on the revolution that lasted from 1910 to 1920, when the poor rallied against the corruption of the government that favored wealthy landowners. This was music to the ears of many young idealists in the 1930s, who were hopeful about proletariat revolutions before being disappointed by their resulting governments. In the story, Big Valley Vineyard, from the Daring Young Man on the Flying Trapeze collection, the narrator describes the days he and a couple of other Fresno idealists worked on the vineyards. Out in the vineyards, we labored with the vines, speaking fraternally with the peons from Mexico, admiring Villa, the bandit, and Orozco, the maniac with the brushes and paint. Peon is a word that Carlton Beals uses to refer to the Mexican lower classes. Pancho Villa was a Mexican Robin Hood, stealing from the rich and leading the revolution against them. Saroyan was also intrigued by the legend of one of his literary idols, California author Ambrose Bierce, who supposedly joined up with Villa as an old man and died in Mexico. Orozco was a Mexican muralist who promoted the causes of the peasants and the workers during the revolution. Beals wrote of the terrible working conditions for Mexican laborers and the rise of the Mexican proletariat during the Mexican Revolution. When Saroyan gets to Mexico City, however, he sees the country with an American colonialist eye, summarizing Mexicans as uncivilized yet dignified. He had visited Tijuana before 1935, it being so close to Hollywood, but his visits to the border town didn't feel authentic to him. Tijuana was filled with American tourists and Mexican merchants, all working at the extremes of capitalism. He writes in Tijuana Tramp Town, which appeared in Rogue magazine in 1962, "As a native of California, of the great San Joaquin Valley, of the city of Fresno, I began to hear about Tijuana when I was a kid, and I began to visit the town in the late 1920s, at which time the town had a magnificent gambling casino." The Agua Caliente Casino opened in 1928, but casino gambling was outlawed in 1935. The Agua Caliente racetrack opened in 1929, where parimutuel or pool betting and license betting flourished. Tijuana is a kind of scalawag's Disneyland. In 3 years, I took my kids once to Disneyland and 3 times to Tijuana. So in 1935, he has new wealth to travel. He takes the Southern Pacific train from San Francisco to Nogales, Mexico, and then a Mexican train to Mexico City, deep within the country. He had just finished his trip to Europe, in which he visited England, France, Scandinavia, Austria, then over to the USSR, Georgia, and Soviet Armenia. Once back in San Francisco, he felt it was time to leave again, and that's when he found himself in Mexico City, unknowingly suffering from appendicitis that would lead to an appendectomy when he returned to San Francisco. This, too, was important to him as his father had suffered from a burst appendix that caused his death in 1911. He tells us he met an American prospector and adventurer on the train who had spent 2/3 of his life in Mexico. The man cultivated a reputation for never being armed, so that in disputes his opposition could never claim self-defense if they shot him. Saroyan found this wise, probably as a person prone to making wisecracks at the expense of others that might endanger his person. In Sons Come and Go, Mothers Hang In Forever, he describes the same adventurer and the trip happening in 1939, and that he was compelled to visit Diego Rivera's house in Mexico City. Rivera had recently painted enormous murals in San Francisco. Saroyan always loved painters and felt Mexico was a visual place that created painters more than writers. He knew some of the same people in San Francisco as Rivera, but he had never been introduced. So, he tells us in Sons Come and Go, he looked up Rivera in the phone book, went to his house, and was allowed inside to meet Rivera and Frida Kahlo, secretly hoping that Leon Trotsky would also be there. Rivera explains that Trotsky had left because they had gotten into a fight about what was best for the people of the world. This incident seems awfully fictional, but there is that element of magical realism so popular in Mexican art that Saroyan manages to harness in this story in the book. Back in this chapter, nominally in 1935, Saroyan found Mexico profoundly attractive and different, even from the nearby borderlands of the United States. One can seldom look at terrain and think of it, this is France, for instance. But in looking at the landscape south of Nogales, I had the feeling unmistakably the land itself was Mexican. It was dry, sandy, rocky, hot, and heavy with many kinds of desert plants. It had repose, dignity, and a sense of the fierceness of survival. Not just human survival, but all survival, animal, insect, bird, and plant. Mexico was starting to feel safe again and was attracting international travelers, opening up new roads extending to America and attempting to drum up tourism. And yet, at the same time, in 1935, a revolt of indigenous people in Chiapas caught headlines. Saroyan looked around Mexico City and felt poverty and backwardness. The Hotel Reforma was the newest and best hotel in the city, he claims, and he wanted to spend his new writer's money living in style, sharply opposed to the residents of the city around him. The Hotel Reforma was built by architect Mario Pani d'Arquier in 1934 in the new Art Deco fashion. It was the first modern hotel to be built in Mexico. Saroyan's descriptions of the city are reminiscent of old westerns. He ends the chapter with, "One Saturday night in a bar, everything was so explosive, hot, secret, and irrepressible, I wondered there wasn't even more violence among the murmuring, milling crowd of surely more than 200 men and women, where just the night before 2 men had died of knife wounds after an argument." There's an air of admiration from Saroyan, who may have imagined this type of lawlessness in his beloved San Francisco during the Gold Rush years. As noted, Saroyan visited again in 1939 and in 1950, and again with his children. To him, Mexico was a fantasy land comprised of both risk and fantasy. In Rock Vagram, the title character rides into Mexico at the end of the book to escape his troublesome life, only to turn around again and face reality. He knew he had driven all night to the sun, as if the sun might be near a little farther south, to see it come up once more and wink. The idea of Mexico being synonymous with escape is both mythical and real. Films and television give the country a warm color correction to reflect its dreamy heat, warmer than the U.S., if not more oppressive in other ways. It has been used frequently as a trope for Americans escaping law enforcement, painting it as a place so free and open that an American can never be brought to justice there, but rather risks perishing in the desert at the hands of heat or bandits. In the border states of Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and California, the concept of Mexico is even more significant, its culture mingling with the other settler cultures, both immigrant and Californio, the Mexican landowners from before 1850 statehood. Its long, porous borders with the U.S. have a storied, real history, from runaway slaves crossing the border to freedom to Native Americans crossing the border to avoid being placed on reservations. For all sorts of religious cults and any type of criminal, Mexico has been the side of the border where the law supposedly can't get to them. And of course, the border has entirely different symbolism for those going into the U.S. In 1930, around 400,000 people of Mexican origin lived in California, out of a total population of 5.7 million, about 7%. Most of them were living in agricultural towns like Fresno. Today, people identifying as having Mexican heritage make up 31% of California's population. Saroyan wrote in obituaries, "I'm a Californian, and the influence of Mexico is great in my heart." In 1947, John Steinbeck wrote The Wayward Bus about a group of people traveling from the central coast of California south, some of them to Mexico and some of them Mexicans. Saroyan adapted this book into a screenplay. It was a subject he and Steinbeck both understood, being Californians from agricultural areas. In his essay, An Inhabitant of the Earth, Saroyan scholar David Colon wrote, "Mexicans appear repeatedly in Saroyan's plays, stories, and memoirs as the original powerful inhabitants of California and Mexico, whom he admired as he worked alongside them in the vineyards of the San Joaquin Valley. Anti-war, pro-love, pro-Indian, black, Mexican, Saroyan in the 30s was way ahead of his time." He goes on to explain that it's Saroyan's multiple identities that helped foster a connection to these other non-European people. Like him, they were discriminated against in Fresno, and the feeling of being American, Armenian, and uniquely Californian are themes that resonate with many second-generation Americans born in the States to immigrant parents. American media itself had built up Mexico as an imagined place of escape for outsiders. In April of 1934, Saroyan wrote to his cousin Kirk, "When I make a lot of money, we'll buy a Ford and drive to Mexico, or Canada, or well, everywhere maybe." During his furlough from the Army in 1943, he considered escape to Mexico rather than return to service. And in 1950, depressed about the divorce from Carol, he detoured to Mexico City on his way east, driving to see his children in New York. He stayed at the Hotel del Prado in Mexico City and felt lonely, even though he felt he seemed cheerful and carefree to those he met there. His fantasies of Mexico were always interrupted by the reality of being there and not feeling any better. It was a place like any other, not some legendary El Dorado. Like the tourists in Tijuana, Saroyan saw Mexico as a place to avoid reality and the hardships of real life, only to find them always with him. Still, it was a symbol of freedom for him, and remains to this day the destination where travelers can put on a mask and become something other than themselves for a short period, for better or worse. Let's put this on the Saroyan map and move on.